Reform of the currency was seen as the key to economic revival.
On every hand, there is an immediate urge to turn money into goods. The Reichsmark has little significance. The dentist would rather take his fee in cigarettes. The laundrywoman will willingly wash your clothes in return for what remains of the soap when she's finished. All ashtrays are swiftly and constantly emptied. Fag ends are worth more than pfennigs.
The Reichsmark was totally valueless. It was a sort of nominal confetti money. There was no incentive for anybody to produce anything or to fill a shop. And a lot of German firms, the big department stores, whatever, who had their cellars or whatever, still pretty well stocked with stuff, did not put anything on the market because it would have meant just throwing valuable substances away.
For the Western Allies, this situation was economically intolerable and politically volatile. It couldn't go on. Britain, France and the United States saw the replacement of the valueless Reichsmark with a new currency, the Deutschmark, as the key to economic reconstruction. Stalin was adamantly opposed to both. It became clear in spring 1948 that the Western powers were ready to consider a constitution for West Germany and to introduce the currency reform without Russian agreement. Stalin could see the writing on the wall for his political and economic ambitions for post-war Germany. Lord Bullock again.
Everybody wanted a united Germany. At some stage, since it was quite clear that the Russians would hang out to the bitter end, you had to say, look, we just can't go on leaving this slum in the heart of Europe indefinitely. So we have to say, well, of course, we'd all prefer a four-power settlement. If we can't get that, then we must organise the part that belongs to the three.
The British and American occupation authorities are perfecting the economic fusion of their own zones.
General Lucius D. Clay.
A German Economic Council has been set up. Under our guidance, these Germans will direct the economic life of their own people.
And so, on the 23rd of June 1948, the Western Allies introduced the new currency. The following day, the Soviet Union announced a total blockade of all road, rail and canal routes to the city. These land links were vital for the survival of West Berlin's 2.5 million inhabitants. Electricity and gas from the Soviet zone were also stopped.
Berlin faces a creeping paralysis as its transport services are curtailed and its industries closed down. Lacking the daily 6,000 tons of coal and raw material, which came by train and barge, shops and factories must close. The people of Berlin face a bleak future.
25. Juni. Die von den Sowjets seit langem gestörte Verbindung Westdeutschland-Berlin wird endgültig unterbrochen.
A great power has stooped to the savage expedient of starving a city as an indirect method to drive the Western Allies from Berlin.
The situation was critical. Quite simply, West Berliners faced starvation. The supplies of fresh milk in the city, for instance, would only last 3 days, putting 6,300 babies at risk.
When the blockade was actually declared, there was a feeling of exhilaration among the service personnel because at last we were doing the job.
There was a sense of shock. There was a sense of total change of atmosphere and considerable apprehension as to where this might lead. One could not believe that Stalin wasn't rational, and yet the things he were doing seemed to be pushing at the borders of rationality.
The German capital has become the microcosm of a tense and waiting world. There's a feeling here that this period of strain must reach a breaking point soon. And therefore, it's not surprising that there's constant talk of war on the lips of many Germans here.
9 years ago, Danzig was the city on which war turned. As history repeats itself, Berlin could be the Danzig of tomorrow.
West Berliners were resilient and utterly resolute. From the very start, they and their leaders made it clear that whatever anyone else did, they would keep going.
Heute weiß die ganze Welt, dass wir hier in Berlin nicht die heimliche, nein, dass wir die wirkliche Hauptstadt Deutschlands sind.
On the first day of the blockade, 70,000 West Berliners demonstrated their determination not to surrender. Ernst Reuter, the governing mayor, told them that the whole world knew that the heart of democracy beat in their city. Belief in themselves was the way to freedom. Freedom was the very air they breathed.
Denn die Freiheit, sie ist und bleibt der Odem unseres Lebens.
But what could be done? The Western Allies dared not challenge the land blockade by force for fear of starting a war. Britain, France and the United States only had 6,500 troops in the city. There were 300,000 Soviet troops surrounding them. General Lucius D. Clay, the US military governor, constantly flirted with the idea of breaking the blockade, but never actually put it to the test.
I then recommended to send an armed convoy into Berlin, because I felt that if it was stopped and had to shoot its way in, we would start the shooting, not the other side. But if it did mean war, we did not have troops in Europe or elsewhere to fight a war. We weren't ready.
David Murphy served for many years in the American intelligence services in Berlin. The information supplied by American agents revealed that Stalin was calling the Western Allies bluff.
Although their reporting made it clear that the Allies would not leave Berlin, this reporting was ignored by Stalin. But at the same time, our reporting from inside the Soviet Army and the East German paramilitary forces made it quite clear that they were in no position, nor did they have any plans to actually go to war to force us out. They were going to rely entirely on the blockade, hoping that our inability to feed the West German population would then cause them to turn against us and force us to leave.
The only thing was where you had rights.
Frank Roberts, then Ernest Bevin's principal private secretary.
And again, Ernie's view was that whereas the Russians were prepared to play fast and loose on the surface access, where there were no written agreements, in the air there were written agreements, and that on the whole the Russians did, well, they thought a very long time before they actually broke written agreements.
So the British and the Americans mobilized all available aircraft. There were embarrassingly few. When the blockade began, the French had none in Germany. The British had just 6 Dakotas, the all-purpose transport workhorse, with 2 more squadrons on the way. The Americans had 100 C-47s, their name for the Dakota. But each aircraft could lift only 2.5 tons. The western sectors of Berlin needed a minimum of 4,000 tons of supplies each day for their barest subsistence. Under those conditions, no one in the West thought that an airlift could do more than buy a few days to open negotiations with the Soviet Union. In the Kremlin, the possibility of an Allied airlift to counter the Soviet blockade was never foreseen. David Murphy has gained access to Russian intelligence reports that were available to Stalin at this time.
They had no information whatsoever on the capabilities of the Allied airlift to supply the West Berlin population. The Soviet officers were all convinced that it would be impossible for the Allies to sustain the population during the winter months. The Soviets, because they'd never dealt with large-scale air transport operations of this kind, simply could not conceive of the manner in which the airlift was conducted.
But the perceptions and expectations of both sides could be changed if more and bigger aircraft were made available to the airlift. The Americans were uneasy and initially reluctant to provide them. Bevin met General Wedemeyer, head of the U.S. Air Force, at the end of June to make his views on the matter perfectly plain. It was a meeting no one ever forgot. Bevin's principal private secretary, Frank Roberts, was there.
It was going to demand far too much of the American Air Force, which after all had to operate in the Far East. They needed a lot of their planes there, and they couldn't give the necessary number of aircraft to ensure its success. And I've never forgotten that, having listened to all this, Ernie sort of said, well, General, I never expected to hear the head of the American Air Force telling me that his Air Force couldn't do what the Royal Air Force is going to do. Not on quite such a big scale, but we're going to do it. And I remember taking Wedemeyer out of the room, and he was rather like a Labrador coming out of a pond, you know. And he shook his head and said, well, I suppose we'll have to, won't we? And I said, well, that was the message.
Even so, American reinforcements were slow to come. Clay went to Washington at the end of July and begged Truman and the National Security Council for the much larger C-54s, which were capable of lifting 10 tons each.
I knew that without the DC-4s, it was hopeless. We couldn't possibly do the job, so I felt really down as the conference ended. But as we were walking out, the president said to me, you and the general come in with me. And we went into his office from the cabinet room, and he said to me right away, he said, you don't look like you are very happy, General. Where's to that effect? And I said, I'm not, Mr. President, because I see that this would be the end of Berlin, and I think it would mean the domination of Europe. And he said, don't worry, General, you are going to get your airplanes. It was just that simple.
Clay got his C-54s in October. The British added every type of military and civilian aircraft hands-on. But increasing numbers and types of plane caused problems of their own. At the height of the airlift, 3,000 aircraft were flying up and down the 3 cramped air corridors each day from no fewer than 9 airfields. Planes were landing and taking off every 4 minutes. This was an air traffic controller's nightmare. Radar was used from the outset by the British, but the Americans didn't start using it in Berlin until September of 1948. Air Vice Marshal Sir Brian Stanbridge was a Hastings pilot at the time.
We were flying really very close together down the corridors, something like 3-minute intervals. So our timing really had to be very precise because we had to arrive at the Berlin end spaced out very precisely so that we could land one after the other.
After takeoff, you would turn onto the track required for Berlin, heading for a particular beacon which would be navigated onto accurately by your navigator. And when you arrive at that particular point, you would call up, say, Golf Easy Fox, rest off beacon 3 seconds early, or 20 seconds early, or 10 seconds late. That gave the aircraft behind you time to... He was listening on that frequency, gave him time to slow down or speed up.
Over. Loud and clear. Roger, 323. Do not acknowledge further instructions. You're 3 miles from touchdown now. Check your undercarriage down.
When we reached the Berlin end, we would then normally be picked up by the ground control approach controller, who would then lead us in on radar to our final landing.
When I was coming into land on a clear day, I was in the slipstream of the plane in front of me, and I could feel the turbulence of it. And when his wheels touched down, another plane at the end of the runway was allowed to take off. Before his wheels were off, my wheels were actually touching down. Now that is tremendous density of flying, and of course there's nothing denser than that even today, and never will be.
Quarter of a mile from touchdown now. Track very good indeed.
I remember one of the comments by one of the Soviet officers in Karlshorst was that when they would look up in the sky, they would see a constant movement in the air from one horizon to the other. There would be nothing but Allied aircraft, Allied transport planes moving right over them. And they even thought that sometimes these aircraft would deliberately fly low over their headquarters in East Berlin, as if to sort of taunt them.
Only the skills of the airmen could compensate for the fact that the bewildering variety of aircraft in use weren't primarily designed for an airlift of this type.
You see, the York wasn't built for this sort of job. Its real role is to do 8 or 9 hour trips, such as from England to Singapore and back, and that sort of thing. But now, under these conditions, they're probably doing, if they stay serviceable, probably doing 6 takeoffs and landings in 24 hours.
We were aiming to do about 2 or 3 trips a day for about 3 days, and then to do about 2 or 3 trips a night for 3 nights, and then have a day off, and then start again. So it was pretty vigorous.
The unsuitability of the planes and the exhausting schedules meant that many accidents happened. 76 people died in the course of the airlift. Rex Waring was a radar operator at Gatow Airfield, and he saw the consequences of the strain.
This particular aircraft, a York aircraft, was carrying kerosene fuel. It came into land and made a very, very heavy landing. The undercarriage immediately collapsed. And the whole thing careered for some distance past the control tower. And then for some time, it's difficult to remember, it was only seconds, this whole lot stood there, and then it exploded into a ball of flame.
I do remember one occasion when I was doing about my third trip in a night, and my co-pilot had gone sick at base, and I decided to fly without one. So I was locked up in the front of the airplane on my own, and I could feel myself nodding off, and I kept shaking myself to come to. The next thing I knew was that the navigator had come rushing forward and was shaking me violently to wake me up. And I had indeed gone to sleep, and the airplane was in a spiral dive. Had he not come through and woken me up, we'd undoubtedly have gone into the ground.
But the airmen had to contend with more than their own exhaustion.
I was coming in on a beautiful summer evening about 9 o'clock, twilight, coming in from the east. And I said to my co-pilot, isn't this a wonderful evening? And all of a sudden, they were blinded by a light source from East Berlin. I said, good God, what are they trying now? And what the Russians had done was put a searchlight on top of a tower, aimed right in our eyes.
A Russian aircraft would often come up alongside you. You could see the man in the cockpit as clear as well, within only a matter of 20 or 30 yards. And he would rock his wings and then dive away and leave you. And, of course, he'd go on to the next aircraft behind. Anything to harass you.
Upon finishing their landing roll, the airplanes are picked up by a follow-me jeep, which directs them to a particular spot on the ramp, immediately met by a loading truck, let me put it that way, a maintenance control jeep that checks the aircraft for any difficulties they may have incurred on their route up, a sandwich truck, or what we call a five-and-dime hamburger joint, meets the airplane. The boys can get their coffee and their hamburgers and sandwiches without ever leaving the area of the aircraft.
You stopped for between 5 and 8 minutes, which then allowed the Germans, who had backed up their trucks to the aircraft, they would then shoot 2 or 3 men into the fuselage. You would undo the chains, throw all the equipment out as fast as they could. And remember, these people were starving, and I mean starving. So things that fell out like potato powder and flour, and even the dried fish and the frozen fish would often fall out in broken pieces. You'd see these men put their hand in the scuppers of the aircraft and pick it up, put it in their mouth to eat. They were starving hungry. And if this did happen, and the overseer, the Dienstmann as they called him, the serviceman, if he saw that happen, wham, he would bring a stick down on their hands.
The chief supplies are flour, meat and vegetables, milk, sugar, potatoes and meat gravy. While one aircraft is landing them, another is circling the airfield preparing to land, and yet another is a black speck, rapidly becoming bigger, against the grey sky over the pine trees. They come roaring up to a group of hangars, doors are thrown open before the propellers stop, RASC lorries back to them, and German civilians take out the contents.
We carried diesel fuel to run the buses and to run the generators, so there was power to operate the lighting systems throughout the city. We had to carry kerosene and petrol, benzene for motor cars, those that were driven that way. We carried things like frozen fish, dried potato powder, POM, as it was called, POM, P-O-M, as it was called in those days. Would you believe, even things like, imagine what it takes to run a city by air. Sanitary towels, these had to be ferried in. Newsprint, flour, coffee. The coffee was never taken in roasted, it was taken in green. Huge sacks of coffee, which once in the airplane, roughly held down by chains, the vibration of the airplane would shake the coffee bean. You know what a beanbag is like when you grab it? Well, a coffee beanbag is just the same. And these things would slide all over the aircraft and upset the trim so that you'd finish up with the tail of the aircraft dragging in the Russian sector.
Diesel fuel was a particularly nasty load, dangerous and volatile. The British specialised in it. They took on other awkward consignments: salt, which could corrode an aircraft, girders and heavy plant to build a brand new power station in the western sectors. They also handled all the backload from Berlin, the industrial exports which might keep the city's economy ticking over, and that meant anything from delicate light bulbs to ungainly grand pianos. The transportation of coal was a particular problem shared with the Americans. It was heavy and bulky, Coal dust coated everything in the aircraft too, even the controls.
There's a colonel in the American Army who tried dumping coal out of a bomber, American bomber, thinking that we could load coal in the bomb bays and fly low and dump the coal. He came in on about 100 feet over the ground and pulled open the bomb bay doors and dropped the coal. The problem was it smashed up. All they had was dust.
Power cuts limit housewives to 2 hours of home lighting a day. Everywhere, household duties go by the clock. While one district sleeps, the day begins in another. Berlin's wooded parks, once the city's pride, are now the city's fuel. Coal delivered by air is reserved for essential industries and for the sick. Necessity makes no other distinctions.
The Allies' best efforts could stop starvation, but they couldn't make life in West Berlin easy or anything like normal.
Anything which was a tall bell was chopped off during the night. Trees, park benches, railway sleepers. People just wanted it was a question of survival. They used just anything they could get hold of.
I know we should think about the politics, democracy and the future of Germany, but it is hard for us to think about anything beyond the next meal.
There must have been a constant droning in the air, and it didn't keep anybody awake. Had there been a gap, people would have sat up in bed.
The airlift helped cement the friendship between the Western Allies and the Berliners they had conquered only 3 years earlier. In the Hearts and Minds War, the Russians offered residents in the western sectors food and fuel at sharply reduced prices if they pledged not to accept food from the Allied airlift. Russian intelligence reports suggested that 2 million West Berliners would take up this offer. In the event, only 19,000 did so. To the Western Allies, the support of the West Berliners was crucial. One man in particular, Gail Halverson, played a significant role in this, as U.S. Air Force Colonel Earl Overholtzer explains.
Gail Halverson started a little thing called Little Vittles. And as he would come over the approach into Tempelhof, he would take a handful of candy bars and just throw them out the window. Later, he started putting handkerchiefs around these candy bars. And then he got his squadron members to start doing this. And he would throw these things out, and they would float down, and the kids would be standing there just jumping for these pieces of candy.
On the morning of the 150th day of the airlift, I was in Berlin at Gatow. We were waiting for the arrival of the 150th aircraft on that 150th day. There was a reception committee to meet it, a reception committee of children, bearing simple gifts and flowers that they'd brought for the crew. When the crew got out, the children greeted them with a song in English.
The people were hungry, the people were ill-dressed, they were cold, it was miserable, but they had hope.
I do recall seeing children sitting on the fencing on the end of the runway shouting to us, and occasionally we would take up some stuff they called Blockade chocolate. This was a chocolate that contained a high degree of fats in it, which was supposed to be in lieu of a meal. And we would sometimes break open a bag or two and throw the chocolate to the children, or cigarettes or chewing gum or whatever we could get. And they would shout their thanks and run away.
People would come out with a handful of flowers to give to a crew. They'd ask permission if they could give the flowers to a crew that came in and landed. And of course, the crew can't speak the German. They can't speak the English. The flowers did all the talking that had to be done.
The Western Allies knew that they had to tell West Berliners what was going on. Thousands of tons of newsprint were flown into the city, occupying precious space in overcrowded aircraft. With power limited to 4 hours each day, the American-backed RIAS, Radio in the American Sector, used mobile radio cars to deliver news and keep up morale. Peter Hertz worked for RIAS at the time.
RIAS programmed news services 10 times a day all around the city,
giving the people the possibility to be informed. It was the basis of the acceptance of radio in Berlin for a long time.
Berlin im Riad.
Heute 50. Tag der Blockade Berlins.
We didn't feel anymore that these people came to occupy. We felt these are Berliners too, and they themselves gave in their whole appearance the same feeling.
But Stalin was told none of this. Had he known how effective the airlift was becoming, he might have ended the blockade sooner. David Murphy's study of Soviet intelligence reports shows how Stalin's agents deliberately shielded him from the truth about the success of the airlift.
There was a report, an excellent report, of a discussion which took place in General Clay's headquarters. He made it perfectly clear that we intended to stay in Berlin. Well, it was interesting that when we looked at the actual Soviet report that was found in the archives, the chap who wrote the report said the source reported these statements as he heard them, but we cannot vouch for the accuracy of his comments. This was typical of the kind of thing that was often done in reporting by their sources, because it was worth your life to go in with something that was not acceptable to Stalin. So even bad news had to be couched very carefully.
Yet even for Stalin, the news got worse and worse. Monthly tonnages rose steadily. The airlift organization was streamlined and increasingly efficient. Yet it was still only a stopgap. There had to be a diplomatic solution. Lord Bullock, Ernest Bevin's biographer again.
Ernie was not a diplomat, but he was an extraordinarily experienced and successful negotiator who had been through hundreds of trade union negotiations and was famous for his skill in this. And time, this was the interesting thing. He believed time was on our side. Now, time was on our side, but only on one condition, that is that you could keep the airlift going.
With the airlift providing a cushion of time, a diplomatic weapon, the Western Allies could, for the first time, adopt a tough negotiating position with Stalin. Concessions on Berlin or Germany were not on offer. In August 1948, Bevin sent Frank Roberts to Moscow to join the American ambassador, General Bedell Smith, and his French colleague, Chateauneuf. The three Western envoys were summoned to an audience with Stalin at 9 p.m.
Well, of course, Stalin had one great advantage in negotiation with the West, in that he wasn't at all what people expected him to be. Stalin, to begin with, was a very small little man. He had a bad arm, so he kept it by his side. He had a very soft voice, and he never raised it. And so this, to begin with, sort of, oh, what a surprise, And he was rather polite.
But although Stalin's manner was affable and friendly, even encouraging about the prospect of lifting the blockade, there was to be a price.
Bedell Smith was the spokesman of the three. He chose to rather do the line of we old soldiers. You see, Stalin was rather fond of being a marshal. I think he was in marshal's uniform when we did our talks. But it became fairly clear that Stalin was thinking in terms of some kind of agreement, which meant withdrawing measures. You see, that was how it was phrased, provided we could find some arrangements for the currency.
As a result of the Moscow meeting, military governors' talks were set up, but they quickly reached deadlock once again. When the Western Allies requested another meeting with Stalin, they were curtly informed that he couldn't talk to them as he was on holiday.
Well, that was a clear message that, it's no good. But obviously I think he decided that he wasn't going to get his way in these negotiations, and that after all, conducting this supplying Berlin through the winter months was going to be probably impossible. General Winter was going to help the Russians once again.
In the British sector, the fourth winter of occupation brings another war to beleaguered Berlin, the battle to survive. Empty shop windows create a new bartering center for Berliners. Notices advertising articles for exchange create a pavement market where strangers meet by appointment for the daily swap. Under the stress of the Russian blockade, rations are pared down to the minimum necessary to keep bodies alive.
The worst worry was icing up. So just before the aircraft were due to take off, all the aircraft control surfaces had to be sprayed with de-icing fluid to make them serviceable. And to get this on the control surfaces, the airmen, friends and myself, had to literally stand on the wings, which were some 15 feet above ground, very slippery, and literally spray these surfaces of the airplane with this de-icing fluid. Because if they were to ice up during takeoff, this could be catastrophic.
The winter of 1948-49 did not turn out to be nearly as severe as expected. Officials had predicted that the airlift tonnage would drop by at least 1/3 during the winter. But there was much less fog and snow than normal, and tonnage figures actually grew slightly over the course of the winter. When spring came in March, the airlift managed to achieve 6,300 tons per day. It was fast becoming apparent to the Russians that the airlift was successfully overcoming the blockade and was proving to be a huge international propaganda coup for the Western Allies. Moreover, the Russians themselves were suffering as a result of their blockade in ways that hadn't originally been predicted. David Murphy again.
They had not realized the degree to which East German factories relied on spare parts and other material from West German sources, so that when the blockade was instituted and there was no movement of goods between West Germany and East Germany, some of their industries would come to a complete halt because of the absence, the inability to obtain these spare parts.
By spring 1949, the airlift was a smooth-running operation which was maintaining, even improving, the standard of living in Berlin. Weekly tonnage figures were shooting up. More and bigger aircraft were promised. At this stage, too, the Russians knew that their blockade of Berlin had failed to frighten the West out of its plans for West German and European recovery. The West Germans had drafted a constitution for a separate state. Marshall aid from America was set to fuel European revival. And in April 1949, the Western Allies signed the Atlantic Pact, the treaty creating NATO.
12 nations combine in a united front from the Tropic of Cancer to the North Pole. An attack on one is an attack on all. That is the pledge the Atlantic democracies proclaim. It binds together a group of peaceful people determined to defend their common way of life. It is a pact for peace, and only guilty men can see in it a threat of arms.
Achtung, Achtung, hier ist Rias, Berlin. In Kürze hören Sie ein Kommuniqué der vier Großmächte über die Aufhebung der Berliner Blockade.
Within 5 weeks, the blockade was over. The announcement came on May the 5th, 1949.
This is Bernard Moore speaking from the headquarters of the United Nations at Lake Success. The final agreement on the lifting of the Berlin blockade was reached at a meeting between the United Nations delegates of the 4 Berlin powers in New York.
Helmstedt, the frontier post, till now the dead end of the west supply route to Berlin, loads up for the first journey through the Iron Curtain. 25,000 tons of fuel and food, doubling the record total of a day's airlift, head for Berlin.
Ich hab so Heimweh nach dem Kurfürstendamm, hab so ne Sehnsucht nach meinem Berlin. Und seh ich auch in Frankfurt, München, Hamburg oder Wien, die Leute sich bemühen, Berlin bleibt doch Berlin.
At midnight on the 12th of May, the barricades went up and the first vehicles were allowed across the Helmstedt checkpoint in the British zone and onto the Autobahn crossing the Russian zone to Berlin.
Well, you can hear those cheers as the first jeep goes through, followed by an army lorry with the Royal Engineers sitting on top, dressed in camouflage suits and
So reopens the lifeline into Berlin. After 11 months of siege, the West is again linked with the East. The Autobahn, overgrown with weeds of neglect, is now choked with bumper-to-bumper traffic.
Our BBC recording car was the 9th to cross the 30 yards of road separating the British and the Russian barriers. There, a Russian officer examined our passes, told me how glad he was that the road was open again, then he shook me by the hand and waved us cheerfully on our way.
On the same day, General Lucius D. Clay thanked the people of West Berlin in a speech at the City Hall in the western sectors.
Today, Berlin is no longer under blockade. I don't think that just means that trains and trucks are running again. I think it has a much deeper significance. I think it means that the people of Berlin have earned their right to freedom, to be accepted by those who love freedom everywhere. And that in the breaking of this physical blockade, there is also accompanying it a breaking in any spiritual or moral blockades which may have closed Berlin in before.
Kinder, ich singe ein Lied von Berlin, von der Stadt, die mir alles ist. Jetzt könnt ihr doch nun endlich auch wieder hin. Ja, wie habt ihr die Luft vermisst? Mein Gott, ist das denn nun nicht wunderschön, dass die Blockade passé und wir wieder Lichter sehen am grünen Strand der Spree.
We are all very happy and still very much excited so that we can hardly believe what's happened to us. The light is on all day long. I personally couldn't really believe it because yesterday I was still taking candles until my mother stopped me and said, "What are you going to take the candle for?" I said, "Well, oh yes," I suddenly remembered, and then I turned all the lights on. I had them all day long, although the sun was shining outside.
You've done it. Come here to say thank you from the bottom of our hearts.
The British Foreign Minister, Ernest Bevin.
This great force which saved us from destruction in the war, having this task with its tremendous energy, intensity of service, regardless of physical strain, made what I think will prove, as time goes on, probably one of the greatest contributions to peace and the liberty of mankind.
Barely a year ago, short of desperate measures, Berlin seemed doomed to communism or starvation. That was Russia's challenge to the world. Now, as the city rejoices, the West, too, acclaims the first major victory of its newfound resolution. For out of Berlin's peril and the plight of her millions has grown a Western alliance powerful enough to enforce Europe's right to peace. In Berlin, where East meets West, the gates are opened to the hope of a world without war.
They saved our lives. It's the same people who bombed us, who brought in their food. I mean, lots of pilots lost their lives. I say thank you.
The Berlin Blockade was presented by John Tusa and produced in Manchester by Laura Craig Gray.